Robert Williams stood in the hallway outside the conference room on the 12th floor of the Carter Building, a bottle of lukewarm Similac Pro Advance formula in his left hand, and watched through floor-to-ceiling glass as the woman the entire city of Baltimore called the Ice Queen sat in her wheelchair, wearing a navy Armani blazer, and cradled his 4-month-old daughter against her chest. Not just cradling, nursing. Sophia's small hand rested on Elizabeth Carter's collarbone, fingers curled loosely, completely at peace. Elizabeth's eyes were closed. Tears ran down her face in two silent streams that caught the afternoon light, coming through the harbor-facing windows. The CEO of Carter Shipping and Logistics, a woman who had fired an entire janitorial crew for using the wrong chemical on the lobby marble, was breastfeeding a stranger's baby in the most public room in the building and crying like her heart was breaking open. Robert stood frozen. The bottle in his hand felt suddenly irrelevant, a prop for a scene that had already moved past him. In that single moment, shattered and suspended, he understood that everything he had believed about this woman, cold, untouchable, incapable of tenderness, was wrong. 3 weeks earlier, Robert had been sitting at the kitchen table in his mother's row house in East Baltimore, staring at a stack of overdue bills he couldn't pay. The electric company wanted $180. The gas bill showed $95. Rent was $1,400, due in 6 days. He had $3,200 left in the savings account that he and Angela had spent 6 years building, back when the future had seemed like something they were walking toward together instead of something that had collapsed behind him. Angela had been gone for 4 months. His wife had died from postpartum hemorrhage less than an hour after giving birth to Sophia, bleeding out faster than the surgical team at Johns Hopkins could repair the damage. Robert had been standing in the hallway 10 feet from the operating room door, close enough to hear the monitors change pitch, close enough to hear the nurses' voices shift from routine to urgent, close enough to hear the silence when everything stopped. He hadn't been the same since. Nobody said that part out loud, but he saw it in the way people looked at him at the grocery store, at the gas station, at the post office. The hollow-eyed black man with a newborn in a car seat, fumbling with his debit card, dropping his keys, forgetting why he'd walked into the room. They saw a man coming apart at the seams, and they stepped carefully around him like he might shatter if they got too close. He'd quit his job as a mechanical engineer at the Baltimore shipyard 3 days after Angela's funeral because the idea of leaving Sophia with anyone, even for 8 hours, made his throat close up. Angela had trusted the hospital. She'd trusted the doctors, the nurses, the system. She'd gone into that operating room believing she'd come back out. Robert had trusted them too. Now Angela was in Woodlawn Cemetery, and Robert couldn't look at his daughter without remembering that the people who were supposed to save his wife had let her bleed to death while he stood 10 feet away, listening. The savings account that had once held $15,000 was down to its last few thousand. Robert had started picking up maintenance contracts, fixing commercial HVAC systems, repairing industrial plumbing, troubleshooting electrical panels in office buildings, anything that paid by the week and let him keep Sophia close. He'd rig a portable crib in whatever basement or storage room the job site offered, set up the white noise machine, clip the baby monitor to his belt, and split himself in two, wrench in one hand, bottle in the other, attention divided between copper fittings and his daughter's breathing. His mother, Brenda, helped when she could. She'd drive over from her place near Patterson Park every morning at 7, her arthritic hands wrapped in compression gloves, and watch Sophia while Robert hustled through whatever job he'd lined up. But this week, Brenda's arthritis had flared so badly in both hands that she couldn't lift the baby without wincing. Robert had watched his mother try to grip a bottle with fingers that wouldn't fully close, watched her face twist with pain she tried to hide, and he'd told her to stay home. He'd called the shipyard, asked if they'd consider rehiring him. The HR manager had been polite but firm. The position had been filled. Maybe take some more time. Get your situation sorted out. Robert had understood the subtext. They'd seen him at Angela's funeral, standing at the podium with Sophia strapped to his chest in a carrier, trying to deliver a eulogy he couldn't finish. Nobody wanted to hire a man who looked like he might break down at his desk. That was when he saw the posting. Margaret Hayes, the executive assistant at Carter Shipping and Logistics, had listed a maintenance contract for the company's 15-story headquarters overlooking the inner harbor. 6 weeks of work, $85 an hour, double the standard rate for this kind of job. Robert had heard the stories about Elizabeth Carter, how she'd terminated an entire cleaning service for leaving streaks on the glass elevator doors, how she held executive meetings at 6 in the morning and expected attendance by 5:45, how 3 contractors before him had walked off the job because the work environment was, in their words, suffocating. Robert didn't care about any of that. He needed $7,200 to clear his debts and cover 2 months of formula. Sophia was going through 6 cans a week at $42 each. The math was simple and brutal. $1,260 a month to feed his daughter with powdered substitute for what Angela's body had been ready to give. The irony sat in his chest like a stone every time he measured scoops into a bottle. Angela had wanted to breastfeed. She'd talked about it through her entire pregnancy, bookmarked articles on her phone, bought nursing bras and a breast pump and a special crescent-shaped pillow. She never got the chance. The problem was childcare. Brenda couldn't hold Sophia for a full workday, and Robert couldn't afford a sitter. On a Sunday afternoon in late July, he drove to the Carter building to scout the layout. The lobby was all polished granite and steel, the kind of place where his work boots felt too loud on the floor. He found a storage room near the ground floor maintenance bay, warm, clean, with a door that locked from the inside. The HVAC unit was a Carrier 50TC model, a system Robert had installed dozens of times during his shipyard days. He checked the humidity levels with a pocket gauge, 45%, exactly where it should be. The temperature held steady at 68 degrees. The fire suppression sprinklers were up to code, and the emergency exit had a clear path to the street. He called Margaret Hayes and explained his situation honestly. He had a 4-month-old daughter. His mother's health was failing. He couldn't afford daycare, and he couldn't leave Sophia alone. He needed to bring her to the job site. There would be a crib, a white noise machine, a monitor. She wouldn't disrupt the work. He'd make sure of it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll approve the room on one condition. Don't let Miss Carter find out. She doesn't do well with surprises." Robert's first encounter with Elizabeth Carter came on a Tuesday morning during his second day on the job. He was repairing the climate control system on the 12th floor, the executive level, where the carpet was thicker and the silence felt intentional, like the building itself was holding its breath. He was on his knees behind a vent panel, a Fluke multimeter in one hand and a Klein screwdriver in the other, when he heard the quiet motorized hum of her wheelchair. He looked up. Elizabeth had stopped in the hallway about 10 feet away, watching him with an expression that wasn't hostile but wasn't warm either. It was the face of someone who had practiced neutrality until it became permanent. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a way that looked both elegant and severe. The wheelchair was a Permobil M3, a high-end model Robert recognized from the distinct sound of its motor. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Robert made in a month. "You're the new contractor?" "Yes, ma'am. The thermostat in my office reads 68, but it feels like 72. Fix it by end of day." Then she was gone, the wheelchair gliding soundlessly down the corridor. Robert watched her go and noticed how every employee in sight adjusted their path, stepping aside with a kind of rehearsed distance, as though Elizabeth had drawn an invisible perimeter around herself that nobody crossed without permission. But Robert had seen something in her eyes that the others seemed to miss, a weariness that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or shipping contracts. He recognized it because he saw it in his own reflection every morning, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone carrying something they couldn't put down and couldn't talk about. Later that afternoon, Margaret brought him coffee in the storage room where he'd set up Sophia's crib. She glanced at the baby, asleep in a nest of blankets, and said quietly, "She's not mean. She's just somewhere else." Robert worked through the rest of the week without incident, moving between floors, replacing wiring, recalibrating sensors, tightening fixtures. Every few hours, he'd slip down to the ground floor to check on Sophia. Brenda came in the afternoons when her hands allowed it, but the mornings were Robert's to manage alone. He'd grown efficient at splitting himself in two, bottle in one hand, socket wrench in the other, baby monitor clipped to his belt like a second heartbeat. On Wednesday of his second week, the freight elevator jammed between floors 7 and 8 during a cable inspection. At the same time, the main water line in the basement mechanical room started leaking, a corroded 3-inch fitting that was dripping onto the electrical panel below. Robert was on the 12th floor when he got the call from building maintenance. The elevator could wait. Water near electricity couldn't. He estimated 20 minutes to get down to the basement, assess the damage, and stop the leak. He checked the monitor clipped to his belt. Sophia was asleep, her breathing steady through the white noise machine's hum. He'd be back before she woke up. The basement was worse than he'd expected. The fitting hadn't just corroded, it had rotted through entirely. Water was streaming down the panel housing, pooling on the concrete floor. Robert shut off the main valve, grabbed his pipe cutter and a replacement copper fitting from his truck, and got to work. Cutting out the old section, cleaning the threads, soldering the new joint, testing the seal. 45 minutes passed before the water stopped and the repair held. Robert was wiping his hands on a shop towel when he heard it through the monitor. Sophia crying, not the soft fussing that meant she was stirring awake, but the sharp escalating wail that meant she'd been crying for a while and had run out of patience. He ran for the stairwell, 12 flights up, 2 steps at a time, his boots echoing off the concrete. His lungs burned, his legs felt like they were filling with sand. By the time he burst through the ground floor door, chest heaving, Sophia had gone quiet. Margaret was there, bouncing the baby gently against her shoulder, her reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair, but her face was tight, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Miss Carter heard the crying through the intercom system, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. She called down to ask what the noise was on the ground floor. I had to tell her, Robert. I couldn't lie to her. Robert's stomach dropped. He took Sophia from Margaret's arms, kissed his daughter's forehead, and climbed back up to the 12th floor, prepared to lose the only job-keeping formula on the table. Elizabeth was in her office behind a wide desk that overlooked the harbor. She didn't look up from her laptop when Robert entered. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the salt air that seeped through the window seals. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of a cargo ship cutting through gray water. How old? Robert blinked. 4 months. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. Elizabeth's hand stopped moving over the keyboard. She turned her chair slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the harbor cranes moved against an overcast sky, slow as the hands of a clock. A container ship was being loaded, the stacked metal boxes swaying slightly as they were lifted into place. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice was flat, but it carried something underneath that Robert couldn't quite name. "Move her to the room next to Margaret's office on the 11th floor. It's quieter. The heating works better there." She didn't explain. She didn't smile. She turned back to her laptop as though she'd just approved a supply order rather than offered an act of unexpected kindness. But she had given his daughter the best room in the building, warm, quiet, one floor directly below her own office. Robert set up Sophia's portable crib on the 11th floor that afternoon. The room was clean, freshly painted, in a soft ivory that caught the late afternoon light from a window overlooking the harbor. As he arranged the diaper bag on a shelf in the closet, his hand brushed against a small cardboard box pushed into the back corner. He pulled it out. Inside were baby clothes, newborn size, tags still attached, all of them in soft shades of blue, a boy's wardrobe, tiny onesies from Jimboree, a pair of hand-knitted booties, a hat with a small embroidered whale on the brim, the kind of detail that spoke of hours spent with yarn and needles, someone's hands working love into every stitch. Robert held one of the onesies in his rough, calloused hands and felt something shift inside his understanding of the woman upstairs, a recognition, a kinship with a grief he hadn't known existed in this building. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She saw what he was holding, and her expression changed from warmth to alarm to something protective and fierce. She crossed the room quickly, took the box from his hands without a word, and said, "That's not yours to see." Her voice was kind but absolute, the voice of someone guarding a wound that wasn't hers to reveal. She carried the box out without looking back. Robert didn't follow, but he understood now, with a certainty that settled into his bones, that Elizabeth Carter had once prepared for a child who never arrived. The second week started with Brenda's condition worsening. A chest cold had settled on top of the arthritis, and her doctor ordered rest. Robert had no backup. He kept Sophia with him through the full workday, the baby tucked into the 11th floor room with the door locked, the white noise machine humming, and the monitor transmitting every breath to the clip on his belt. On Wednesday afternoon, a pipe burst in the basement mechanical room, a corroded fitting on the fire suppression line that sent water spraying across the electrical panels. Robert was on the 10th floor rewiring a junction box when the call came through. It was urgent. It couldn't wait. He left Sophia sleeping soundly in her crib, locked the door, checked the monitor signal twice, and estimated 20 minutes for the repair. The pipe was worse than he thought. The fitting had corroded through entirely and needed to be cut out and replaced with new copper. The water pressure was higher than expected, and stopping the flow required shutting down 2 additional valves he hadn't anticipated. 45 minutes passed before the water stopped and the seal held. When he finally climbed back up to the 11th floor, hands damp, shirt soaked through with sweat and pipe water, the monitor was silent, completely silent. That was wrong. Sophia should have been awake by now, crying for her bottle. Robert opened the door. The crib was empty. The white noise machine hummed to an absent room. His heart dropped through his ribs like a stone through water. He searched the room, the hallway, the bathroom across the corridor. Nothing. Then he saw Margaret at the far end of the hall, standing near the elevator with an expression he couldn't read. She didn't speak. She simply pointed upward with one finger. Robert took the stairs 2 at a time, still clutching the bottle of formula he'd prepared before going to the basement. The 12th floor was deserted. the lunch hour between noon and 1, when the executive suite emptied out completely. He moved through the corridor toward the main conference room, his boots silent on the thick carpet. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall, he saw them. Elizabeth was in her wheelchair, positioned near the head of the long conference table. The navy blazer she'd worn that morning for an investor presentation looked crisp under the warm overhead lighting. Sophia was in her arms, pressed against her chest, nursing. Elizabeth's eyes were closed. Tears tracked down her cheeks in two steady, unbroken lines. The baby's small hand rested on Elizabeth's collarbone, fingers curled loosely, completely at peace. The afternoon light through the harbor-facing windows turned the scene into something framed and suspended. Simultaneously, the most intimate and the most exposed image Robert had ever witnessed. A woman's most private moment unfolding in the most public space in the building. Robert's first instinct was protective, a father's reflex, ancient and unthinking. Every muscle in his body tensed to move, to intervene, to take his daughter back. But then he saw how peacefully Sophia lay against Elizabeth's body, how his daughter's breathing was slow and content. He saw the tears on Elizabeth's face, not tears of guilt, not tears of calculation, but something older and deeper, grief, longing, a body answering an instinct that had no child of its own to answer it. Robert didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't bang on the glass or reach for the handle. He stood on the other side of the wall and let the moment exist. And in that stillness, something inside him rearranged. This woman had not taken his daughter. She was coming apart quietly and completely, and her body had reached for the nearest thing that might hold her together. Elizabeth opened her eyes and saw Robert through the glass. The composure she had maintained for what must have been years through board meetings and investor calls and physical therapy sessions where she probably bit down on a towel to keep from screaming, collapsed in a single breath. Her body trembled. The door cracked open a few inches. Her voice came through, fractured and raw. "I didn't plan this. My body just... I heard her crying, and my body just..." Robert pushed the door open gently. He stepped inside and lifted Sophia from Elizabeth's arms with careful, steady hands. He placed the bottle on the long conference table, pulled a chair close to her wheelchair until they were at the same height, and sat down. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't demand one. He asked the question that no one, not the board, not the therapists, not the doctors, not the lawyers, not the employees who stepped aside when she passed, had thought to ask Elizabeth Carter in what was clearly a very long time. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth didn't answer, but for the first time in however many years she'd been carrying this weight, she didn't turn her chair and wheel herself away. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Robert fed Sophia the bottle in the conference room while Elizabeth sat across from him, silent, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair like she was holding herself in place. When Sophia finished eating, Robert carried her back down to the 11th floor and settled her into the crib. He returned to his work, finishing the pipe repair, testing the pressure, documenting the fix in his logbook, but his mind kept circling back to what he'd seen. He left the building at 6 that evening. Brenda was waiting at his mother's house to take over for the night. Robert handed Sophia off, kissed his daughter's forehead, and drove home in silence. The image of Elizabeth's tears burned into his memory. The next morning, Elizabeth video-called Dr. Rachel Bennett from behind the closed door of her office. Robert didn't know this was happening, wouldn't know until much later, but Elizabeth told the doctor everything. The baby's crying, how her body had responded without permission, the milk that had come unbidden, warm and involuntary, the way grief sometimes arrives in the body before the mind can name it. Dr. Bennett was an endocrinologist at Johns Hopkins, the one physician who had seen the full picture of Elizabeth's condition over the past 2 years. She listened without interrupting, and when Elizabeth finished, the doctor confirmed what Elizabeth had known but refused to say out loud. Galactorrhea, persistently elevated prolactin levels, driven by unresolved psychological trauma, layered on top of permanent physical damage. Elizabeth's body was producing breast milk because, at the deepest neuroendocrine level, her system had never recalibrated. Her hypothalamic pituitary axis had locked into a loop of grief that no amount of willpower could override. Her body still believed she was a mother. Dr. Bennett had offered medication 2 years ago, cabergoline, a dopamine agonist that would suppress prolactin and stop the milk within weeks. Elizabeth had refused then, and she refused again now, because the milk was the last physical thread connecting her to the son she had lost. Every other trace of him existed only in memory or in objects she'd hidden away. But the milk was produced by her body without permission, warm and persistent, and, in some terrible private way, it was the most honest part of her. It was her body's refusal to accept what her mind had been forced to. Robert arrived at work the next day and acted as though nothing had changed. He didn't mention the conference room. He didn't look at Elizabeth with pity or careful gentleness when their paths crossed in the hallway. He fixed what needed fixing and treated her exactly as he had the day before. This was his form of respect, and Elizabeth recognized it instantly. A man who had witnessed her most exposed moment and chose to give her dignity instead of commentary. The only thing Robert changed was the door. He left Sophia's room unlocked now, propped open, where before he had always secured it shut. At noon, Elizabeth did something she hadn't done once in 2 years. She left the 12th floor during business hours. She took the elevator down 1 floor and stopped in the doorway of Sophia's room. Robert was inside, feeding the baby from a bottle. He looked up, met her eyes, and nodded, a gesture as simple and enormous as an outstretched hand. Elizabeth wheeled inside. They sat quietly. The only sounds were Sophia's soft pulling at the bottle and the distant mechanical hum of the building systems. Then Robert spoke. He told her about Angela, the first time he had talked about his wife to anyone other than his mother, how she'd hemorrhaged after delivery, how he'd been in the hallway 10 feet from the operating room door, hearing everything, the monitors beeping their steady rhythm, then the urgency in the nurses' voices, then the terrible quiet. "I was 10 feet away," Robert said, his voice low and steady, "and I couldn't do a single thing." Elizabeth was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. His name was Jonah. It was the first time she had said her son's name to another person in 2 years. Robert didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer hollow phrases about time healing wounds or God having plans. He said, "Jonah, that's a strong name." 5 words, and in them he did what no one else had done. He acknowledged that her son had existed, not as a medical event, not as a loss to manage, but as a person with a name his mother had chosen for him. Elizabeth looked at Robert, and the wall behind her eyes cracked a little further. The days that followed took on a rhythm Robert hadn't expected. Every afternoon at noon, Elizabeth would take the elevator down from the 12th floor and wheel herself into Sophia's room on the 11th. She never announced herself. She would simply appear in the doorway, and Robert would look up from whatever he was doing, feeding Sophia, changing her diaper, folding the tiny onesies that came out of the building's industrial dryer, still warm, and nod. Elizabeth would wheel in, and they would sit in the kind of silence that didn't need filling. On the 3rd day, Dusty used to say, Robert was giving Sophia a bottle when Elizabeth asked, What was her name? Robert knew immediately she meant Angela. Angela Marie Williams. She was a nurse at Union Memorial, pediatric ICU. She wanted to breastfeed more than anything. He paused, watching Sophia's mouth work at the bottle's nipple. Bought all the books, watched all the videos, set up the pump before she even went into labor. Like, if she prepared enough, nothing could go wrong. Elizabeth's hands tightened on her armrests. Preparation doesn't stop the world from taking what it wants. Robert looked at her then, really looked, and saw the exhaustion written into every line of her face. How long has your body been doing this? Producing milk? 2 years, give or take. Elizabeth's voice was clinical, detached, like she was describing someone else's condition. The doctors have a name for it. Galactorrhea. My prolactin levels won't normalize. They think it's trauma-related. Psychological feedback loop combined with nerve damage from the accident. They offer you anything to stop it? Cabergoline, a dopamine agonist. It would suppress the prolactin, dry up the milk within a few weeks. Elizabeth looked out the window at the harbor. A tugboat was pulling a barge through the gray water. I said no. Robert didn't ask why. He understood. The milk was proof. Proof that her body had been ready. Proof that somewhere in the biology of her grief, she was still a mother, even if the child was gone. Jonah, Robert said quietly. You said his name was Jonah. Elizabeth nodded, and for a moment Robert thought she might wheel herself out of the room. Instead, she stayed. Jonah Alexander Carter. I was 7 months along when the accident happened. I'd already painted the nursery, bought the crib, learned to knit so I could make him a blanket. Her voice cracked slightly. I was terrible at it. The stitches were uneven, but I kept going because I wanted him to have something I made with my own hands. Robert shifted Sophia to his shoulder, patting her back gently until she burped. What happened? Car accident. Route 1, up near Rockland. I lost him. Lost the use of my legs. Woke up 2 days later in a hospital bed, and everything was gone. Elizabeth's eyes were dry, but her voice carried the weight of tears that had already been cried, probably alone, probably in the dark. Everyone who came to see me wanted to talk about the company, the board, the contracts, the stock price. Nobody asked about Jonah. Robert's throat tightened. I'm asking. Elizabeth looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but opening. He was real. I felt him move. I sang to him. I read to him every night before bed, economics textbooks, shipping manifests, whatever I was working on, because I wanted him to know my voice. And then he was gone, and it was like he'd never existed. No funeral, no grave, just gone. He existed, Robert said. The words came out harder than he intended, sharp with conviction. Everything you did for him was real. The crib, the blanket, the songs, all of it. Elizabeth's composure fractured. She pressed her palms against her eyes, shoulders shaking silently. Robert didn't move to comfort her. He understood instinctively that what she needed wasn't touch. It was space to fall apart without someone trying to put her back together. When Elizabeth finally lowered her hands, her eyes were red but clear. Thank you. Robert just nodded. Sophia had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. He stood slowly and laid her in the crib, tucking a thin blanket around her legs. When he turned back, Elizabeth was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're a good father. I'm trying to be. Robert sat back down, the chair creaking under his weight. Most days I feel like I'm failing, like I'm one mistake away from losing her too. You won't. You don't know that. No, Elizabeth admitted, but I know what it looks like when someone's doing their best, and you are. The conversation stayed with Robert for the rest of the day. That evening, after Brenda picked up Sophia, he drove home to the small apartment he'd rented in Fells Point, a one-bedroom walk-up with water-stained ceilings and a radiator that clanged like a prisoner rattling bars. He sat on the edge of his bed and thought about Elizabeth's face when she'd said Jonah's name, the way her voice had broken, the way she'd thanked him for something as simple as acknowledging her son had been real. He thought about Angela, too, how she used to talk about their future like it was a place they could visit if they just worked hard enough. She'd wanted 3 kids, a house with a backyard, a dog, maybe 2. Sunday dinners with extended family crowding around a table too small to hold everyone. All of it was gone now, buried with her in Woodlawn Cemetery under a granite headstone Robert still couldn't afford to pay off. The next week brought a routine that felt almost normal. Robert would arrive at the Carter Building at 7 in the morning, set up Sophia's crib, and start his rounds. Fire suppression systems, HVAC maintenance, electrical panel inspections. At noon, Elizabeth would come down, and they would sit together while Sophia napped or fussed or stared at the ceiling with the unfocused wonder of infants who haven't yet learned to distinguish between dream and waking. They talked about small things, the weather, the Orioles' losing streak, the new coffee shop that had opened on Pratt Street. And sometimes they talked about bigger things, grief, loss, the way the world kept turning even when it felt like it should stop. On Friday afternoon, Elizabeth's phone buzzed on the armrest of her wheelchair. She glanced at the screen, and her face went carefully blank. "I need to take this." Robert nodded, gathering Sophia into his arms. He stepped into the hallway to give Elizabeth privacy, but the door didn't close all the way, and he could hear her voice through the gap. "Stephen, what do you need?" A pause. "I'm aware of the board meeting. You've reminded me 3 times this week." Another pause, longer this time. "Some members have concerns about what, exactly?" Robert heard the shift in her tone, still controlled, but with an edge now, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. "Leadership continuity. I see. And these concerns, Stephen, do they originate from actual board members, or are you manufacturing a crisis to justify your ambitions?" The silence that followed was cold enough that Robert felt it through the door. "We'll discuss this at the meeting, not before." Elizabeth's voice dropped to something harder, flatter. "And, Stephen, if you're going to come after my position, at least have the decency to do it to my face instead of hiding behind vague insinuations about my stability." The call ended. Robert heard the faint sound of the phone being set down, then the quiet hum of Elizabeth's wheelchair moving toward the door. He stepped back as she emerged, her face composed again, but he could see the tension in her jaw. "Everything okay?" "Family politics." Elizabeth's smile didn't reach her eyes. "My cousin thinks I'm unfit to run the company. He's been planting doubts with the board for months." Robert shifted Sophia to his other shoulder. "What's his angle?" "Control, money, power, pick your poison." Elizabeth wheeled past him toward the elevator. "The board meeting's in 3 weeks. He'll make his move then." "You gonna fight him?" Elizabeth stopped, her hand hovering over the elevator button. "I don't know yet." Robert wanted to say something, offer reassurance, encouragement, solidarity, but the elevator doors opened and Elizabeth was gone before he could find the words. That weekend, Robert couldn't stop thinking about the phone call, about the way Elizabeth's voice had gone cold and sharp when she'd said her cousin's name, about the weariness in her face when she'd admitted she didn't know if she'd fight back. On Monday morning, he arrived early and found Margaret in the lobby, sorting through a stack of mail. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret looked up, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. Depends on the question. Elizabeth's cousin. Stephen, what's his deal? Margaret set the mail down slowly. Why do you want to know? Because I heard her on the phone with him Friday, and because I don't like the way she looked afterward. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the small office behind the reception desk. Come with me. Inside, Margaret closed the door and leaned against the desk, arms crossed. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. Understood? Robert nodded. 2 years ago, Elizabeth was in a car accident. Route 1, up near Rockland. The car rolled twice, hit a tree on the passenger side. She was 7 months pregnant. She lost her son and the use of both legs. Margaret's voice was steady, but her eyes were hard. Stephen was driving. Robert felt the floor drop out from under him. What? He'd had 2 drinks at a client dinner. Bourbon, neat. He was over the legal limit, but not by much, enough to slow his reaction time when he missed the curve. Margaret's jaw tightened. Elizabeth was in the passenger seat. She took the worst of the impact. Stephen walked away with a broken collarbone and a cut over his eye. Jesus Christ! Robert's hands curled into fists. And he's still working here? Still on the board? He's the CFO, and he was never charged. Why the hell not? Margaret looked at him steadily. Because Elizabeth told the police she was driving. The words hung in the air like smoke. Robert stared at her, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. She took the blame for an accident that killed her son and put her in a wheelchair? She took the blame to save the company. Margaret's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. If the truth had come out, that the CFO of Carter Shipping had been driving drunk, that he'd caused an accident that killed the CEO's unborn child and left her paralyzed, it would have been a scandal. Investors would have pulled out. Contracts would have been canceled. 3,000 employees would have lost their jobs. Robert felt sick. So she sacrificed everything. Her legs, her son, her reputation, her right to be angry. Margaret straightened, her expression hardening again. And Stephen has spent the last 2 years climbing over her sacrifice like it's a ladder. Now he wants her chair. Robert's mind was racing. Does he know that she knows? That she remembers he was driving? Of course he knows. And he knows she'll never tell, because the second she does, the company collapses. Margaret's eyes narrowed. That's his leverage. As long as Elizabeth stays silent, she's complicit in the cover-up. If she ever tries to expose him, she destroys everything she gave up Jonah to protect. Robert leaned against the wall, trying to process it all. That's why she won't fight him. That's why she can't. Margaret picked up the stack of mail again, signaling the conversation was over. Now you know. What you do with that information is up to you. Robert spent the rest of the day working on autopilot, his hands going through the motions of tightening bolts and testing voltage, while his mind circled the truth Margaret had given him. Elizabeth had lost her son because of Stephen's recklessness. She'd lost her legs. She'd lost her future. And then she'd taken the blame to protect the people who worked for her, condemning herself to 2 years of silent grief while the man responsible climbed the corporate ladder she'd built with her shattered body. At noon, Elizabeth came down to Sophia's room as usual. Robert was holding his daughter, rocking her gently while she dozed. Elizabeth wheeled in, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Robert broke the silence. Margaret told me. Elizabeth went very still. Told you what? About the accident. About Stephen. About what really happened. Elizabeth's face didn't change, but something in her eyes shuddered. She had no right. Maybe not, but I'm glad she did. Robert shifted Sophia in his arms. You've been carrying this alone for 2 years. It's not your burden to carry. No, but it's not yours alone, either. Robert met her gaze. You saved 3,000 jobs. You protected your company. You did what you thought you had to do. But Elizabeth, he's still here. He's still coming after you, and you're still protecting him. I'm protecting the company. At what cost? Robert's voice was quiet, but firm. How long are you supposed to bleed for a mistake that wasn't yours? Elizabeth's hands gripped her armrests. You don't understand. Then help me understand. If I tell the truth now, everything I've done, everything I gave up, it all means nothing. Jonah's death would have been for nothing. Her voice cracked. I can't let that happen. Robert wanted to argue, to tell her that her son's death already meant nothing to the man who caused it, that Stephen was using her sacrifice as a weapon against her. But he could see the wall going up behind Elizabeth's eyes, the same wall she'd used to survive 2 years of impossible grief. So instead he said, Jonah's death wasn't for anything, it just was, and you've been trying to make it mean something by protecting everyone except yourself. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to let the people who depend on you see what it cost. Maybe it's time to be angry. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned her wheelchair and left. Robert didn't see her the next day, or the day after that. Margaret told him Elizabeth was working from home, handling meetings remotely. Robert finished his maintenance rounds, took care of Sophia, and tried not to think about the look on Elizabeth's face when he'd told her it was time to be angry. On Thursday afternoon, Robert was replacing a faulty circuit breaker on the 13th floor when he noticed something odd. The floor plans listed this level as mechanical storage, but when he'd come up here for the fire suppression check weeks ago, he'd found something else entirely. He walked down the hallway, past empty offices with doors that hadn't been opened in years, until he reached the room at the far end. The door was unlocked. Inside, the space had been converted into a private rehabilitation gym. Parallel bars ran along one wall. Therapy mats covered the floor. A recumbent exercise bike sat near the windows, the kind designed for people with lower body paralysis. This was where Elizabeth came to train, to push her body through exercises that most people would never see, never know about. But it was the far wall that made Robert stop. Ultrasound images, pinned in a careful row. A prenatal appointment calendar, each date circled in blue ink, the last 3 circles empty. A small blue blanket, hand-knitted with slightly uneven stitches, mounted in a simple frame behind glass. A mobile of carved wooden whales meant for a crib that would never hold a child, resting on a shelf beside a book of baby names with a single page dog-eared. This was Jonah's floor. Everything Elizabeth had prepared for her son, everything too painful to keep in daily view, but too sacred to throw away, had been gathered here and suspended between the working world below and the open sky above. Robert heard the elevator doors open behind him. He turned to see Elizabeth wheeling down the hallway, her face tight with something between fury and despair. You had no right. Robert held his ground. Fire suppression flagged a pressure drop. Building code required me to check. Get out. But the anger didn't hold. It cracked like ice under weight. And what came through wasn't rage, but collapse. Elizabeth's breath hitched. Her hand shook. For the first time since Robert had met her, she didn't turn away. She let herself break. Robert moved without thinking. He dropped to one knee beside her wheelchair, bringing himself level with her eyes. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her, just stayed. When Elizabeth could breathe again, she started talking about the crib she'd ordered from a craftsman in Annapolis, white oak with hand-carved spindles, about the mobile of wooden whales, because she'd grown up sailing in the Chesapeake and wanted Jonah to love the water the way she did, about the nursery she'd painted sage green on a Saturday in September, while jazz played on the radio, about the clothes she'd washed and folded and refolded because she wanted them soft enough for newborn skin, about the songs she'd sung quietly to her belly in the evenings when the building was empty and no one could hear the CEO of Carter Shipping being tender. And then one night all of it was gone, Elizabeth whispered. I woke up in a hospital with no legs and no son, and every single person who came to see me wanted to talk about quarterly projections and market share and investor confidence. Nobody asked about Jonah. Nobody said his name. It was like he'd never existed. Robert's voice was steady when he spoke. He was real. Everything you did for him was real. The crib, the blanket, the whales, the songs, all of it was real. And it mattered. Not because it saved the company or protected jobs or kept the stock price stable. It mattered because he was your son and you loved him. Elizabeth looked at him, tears streaming down her face, and Robert saw the moment something inside her gave way. Not breaking, exactly. More like a dam that had been holding back 2 years of grief, finally opening just enough to let some of the pressure out. Robert stood and walked to the door. He didn't go far, just down to the 11th floor, where Sophia was napping in her crib. He lifted his daughter carefully, wrapped her in a blanket, and carried her back up to the 13th floor. Elizabeth was still there, sitting by the windows, looking out at the harbor. Robert laid Sophia on one of the therapy mats, close enough that Elizabeth could reach her. His daughter stirred, made a small sound, then grabbed Elizabeth's finger with the unthinking strength of an infant who doesn't yet know what holding on means. Elizabeth stared down at Sophia, then up at the framed blanket on the wall, two worlds touching, the one she'd lost and the one that had found her without asking permission. Robert sat on the floor beside the mat. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Elizabeth didn't answer, but she didn't let go of Sophia's hand either. They stayed like that until the light began to fade and the harbor turned silver in the dusk. When Sophia woke and started to fuss, Elizabeth looked at Robert with a question in her eyes. He nodded. She lifted his daughter carefully, positioned her against her chest, and let her body do what it had been trying to do for 2 years. Robert watched his daughter nurse, watched the tension leave Elizabeth's shoulders, and thought about all the ways grief could live in a body. How it could turn into milk, into sleepless nights, into rehabilitation exercises no one would ever see. How it could be a weight you carried alone until someone else showed up and said, I see you, I see what this cost, and I'm not leaving. When Sophia finished, Elizabeth handed her back to Robert with shaking hands. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy, but there was something different in her expression now. Something raw and honest, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit lighter. Thank you, Elizabeth said quietly. Robert stood, cradling Sophia against his shoulder. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. Elizabeth's voice was firm now, stronger. You're the first person in 2 years who's seen me as something other than the wheelchair or the CEO or the tragedy. You see me, and that matters. Robert met her eyes. Then let me help you fight Stephen. Let me help you take back what's yours. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded once and wheeled herself toward the elevator. Robert followed, Sophia warm and sleeping in his arms, and understood that something fundamental had shifted. They weren't employer and contractor anymore. They weren't even just two people sharing space while they grieved. They were allies, and maybe, just maybe, they were something more. The following Monday, Robert arrived at the Carter Building to find Margaret waiting in the lobby with an expression that suggested the world had tilted slightly off its axis overnight. She gestured him toward her office before he could even set down his tool bag. Stephen moved up the board meeting. It's this Friday now instead of 3 weeks out. Robert felt his stomach drop. Can he do that? He's CFO. He convinced the chairman there's an urgent financial matter that requires immediate attention. Margaret's mouth was a thin line. It's a play. He's trying to catch Elizabeth off guard. Does she know? I called her an hour ago. She's on her way in. Robert found Elizabeth in her office 20 minutes later, surrounded by spreadsheets and financial reports that covered every surface of her desk. She barely looked up when he entered. I have 4 days to build a case that I'm fit to run this company. 4 days to prove that Stephen's concerns about my leadership are unfounded. Her voice was clipped, efficient, the voice of someone who'd learned to function under pressure. He's going to come at me with everything. The floor I've kept hidden, the rehabilitation expenses charged to the company, the fact that I've been working reduced hours for 2 years, and the fact that you've been nursing a contractor's baby in the conference room. Elizabeth's hands stilled on the keyboard. Margaret told you he has footage? She didn't have to. It's the obvious move. This building has cameras everywhere. Robert crossed his arms. Question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know yet. Yes, you do. Robert kept his voice level. You're going to tell them the truth. Elizabeth looked up sharply. About Stephen? About the accident? About all of it. Jonah, the galactorrhea, why you've been producing milk for 2 years. Why seeing a 4-month-old baby in distress triggered something in you that's completely human and completely understandable. Robert leaned against the doorframe. You're going to stop letting Stephen control the narrative. You're going to own it. If I do that, I expose everything I've been hiding. The board will see me as unstable. They already think you're unstable. Stephen's made sure of that. Robert stepped closer. But if you tell them yourself, if you walk into that room and show them what it costs to run this company while carrying the weight you've been carrying, they'll see strength, not weakness. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. You're asking me to make myself vulnerable in front of people who are looking for any excuse to remove me. I'm asking you to stop protecting the man who destroyed your life. The words landed like a physical blow. Elizabeth's breathing went shallow. For a moment, Robert thought she might tell him to get out, to leave her alone, to take his daughter and his opinions and his unwanted compassion and disappear. Instead, she said, I need to see the footage. Whatever Stephen has, I need to know exactly what he's working with. Margaret produced the security recordings that afternoon. They sat in Elizabeth's office, Robert, Elizabeth, and Margaret, and watched grainy footage of the conference room from 3 different angles. The timestamps showed various instances over the past 2 weeks. Elizabeth holding Sophia, Elizabeth with her eyes closed, tears on her face, Elizabeth looking up and seeing Robert through the glass. The images were damning in their intimacy. Stripped of context, they looked exactly like what Stephen would claim they were. Evidence of erratic behavior, inappropriate conduct, a CEO who'd lost her grip on professional boundaries. He's going to frame this as a mental health crisis, Margaret said quietly. Post-traumatic instability, grief-induced delusion. He'll bring in a psychiatrist who'll testify that you're suffering from unresolved trauma that's affecting your judgment. Elizabeth watched the footage loop again. He's not wrong. That doesn't make him right. Robert's voice was sharp. Grief isn't a disqualifying condition. And what you did, responding to a crying baby when your body was biologically primed to respond, that's not insanity. That's neuroscience. The board won't see it that way. Then make them see it differently. Robert turned off the monitor. You've spent 2 years running this company through the worst thing that ever happened to you. You've never missed a quarterly target. You've never lost a major contract. You brought in 2 new defense deals in the last 60 days alone. Those are facts. Stephen's going to try to bury them under emotional arguments about your fitness, but facts are what the board cares about. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment.
Then, I'll need everything. Financial reports, contract summaries, growth projections for the next 5 years, and I'll need you there.
Robert blinked. Me? You're the only person in this building who knows the whole truth. Stephen's going to paint me as isolated, detached, incapable of human connection. Having you there, having Sophia there, proves him wrong. You want me to bring my daughter to a board meeting? I want the board to see what I see when I look at you. Elizabeth's eyes were steady now, clear. A father doing everything he can to take care of his child. Someone who understands what it means to keep going when the world tells you to break. Someone who chose to trust me even after seeing me at my worst. Robert felt something shift in his chest. Okay, we'll be there. The next 4 days were a blur of preparation. Elizabeth worked 18-hour shifts, compiling reports, running projections, rehearsing answers to every question she could anticipate. Robert continued his maintenance rounds during the day, but in the evenings he stayed late, feeding Sophia in Elizabeth's office while she worked, occasionally offering observations that made her pause and reconsider her approach. On Wednesday night, Robert asked, "What are you going to say about Jonah?" Elizabeth stopped typing. "I'm going to tell them he existed, that I was 7 months pregnant when I lost him, that my body has been in a state of prolonged grief response ever since." She looked at Robert. "And I'm going to tell them that I've been managing it, that it hasn't affected my ability to do my job." "Has it?" "Yes." The admission came out raw. "Not in the ways Stephen will claim, but yes, there are days when getting out of bed feels impossible. Days when I sit in that gym on the 13th floor and wonder what the point is. Days when I look at the mobile I bought for Jonah and think about what he would have looked like at 2 years old, at 5, at 10. Elizabeth's hands curled into fists. "But I get up anyway. I do the work anyway. I run this company anyway, and that should count for something." "It does." Robert shifted Sophia to his other shoulder. "More than you know." Thursday afternoon, Stephen made his next move. He submitted a formal psychological evaluation to the board, a report commissioned from a private consultant who'd never actually examined Elizabeth, but had reviewed her medical records and concluded that she was suffering from complicated grief disorder with dissociative features. The report recommended immediate medical leave and a full psychiatric assessment before she could resume her duties. Margaret brought Elizabeth a copy, her face pale with anger. "This is slander. He's diagnosing you based on records he had no legal right to access." Elizabeth read through the report with clinical detachment. "He got to my endocrinologist somehow. Dr. Bennett's notes are all over this. We can file a complaint with the medical board. This is a massive HIPAA violation." "We don't have time." Elizabeth set the report aside. "The meeting's tomorrow morning. Stephen's timing is deliberate. He wants me reacting instead of preparing." Robert, who'd been listening from the corner of the office where he was changing Sophia's diaper, spoke up. "So don't react. You already have everything you need. Financial performance, contract wins, strategic vision. Let him waste his energy on character assassination while you focus on the numbers. The board will read this report. They'll have questions. Then answer them, honestly, without apology." Robert fastened the diaper and picked up his daughter. "You're not crazy, Elizabeth. You're grieving. Those are different things, and anyone who can't tell the difference doesn't deserve to run this company." That night, Robert stayed at the office until nearly midnight. Brenda had taken Sophia home hours ago, giving Robert space to help Elizabeth finalize her presentation. They worked in silence mostly, Elizabeth typing while Robert reviewed documents, flagging inconsistencies, asking questions that forced her to sharpen her arguments. Around 11, Elizabeth pushed back from her desk and rubbed her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Robert looked up from the 5-year strategic plan he'd been annotating. "Doing what?" "Helping me. You don't owe me anything. You could finish your contract, take your money, and walk away from all of this." "I could." Robert set the document down. "But then I'd be just another person who saw you hurting and decided it wasn't my problem. Most people would make that choice. I'm not most people." Robert met her eyes. "And neither are you." Elizabeth held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Let's see if we can actually pull this off." Friday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of October day where the wind off the harbor cut through jackets and made the city feel older than it was. Robert dressed Sophia in a clean onesie and the small cardigan Brenda had knitted, packed extra bottles and diapers, and drove to the Carter building with a sense of walking toward something inevitable. Elizabeth was already in the boardroom when he arrived, her wheelchair positioned at the head of the long table. She wore a charcoal suit that looked like armor, her hair pulled back, her face carefully neutral. The board members were filtering in, 7 people in total, including Stephen, who sat at the opposite end of the table with a leather portfolio and an expression of barely concealed satisfaction. Margaret met Robert in the hallway outside. "You don't have to stay for this. Elizabeth will understand if you want to keep Sophia out of it." Robert looked through the glass at Elizabeth, sitting alone at the head of the table, and shook his head. "We're staying." He positioned himself just outside the boardroom, where Elizabeth could see him through the glass wall. Sophia was awake, looking around with the vague curiosity of an infant who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. Several board members glanced in Robert's direction, their expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. Stephen started his presentation at exactly 9 o'clock. He opened with a summary of Elizabeth's medical history, the accident, the paralysis, the loss of her pregnancy. Then he pivoted to his concerns, the private rehabilitation floor that Elizabeth had funded through company resources, the reduced work hours, the documented instances of erratic behavior that suggested she was suffering from untreated psychological trauma. He played the security footage on the large monitor at the center of the table. The images were even more stark on the big screen, Elizabeth with her eyes closed, tears streaming, a baby that clearly wasn't hers pressed against her chest. "This footage was taken 2 weeks ago in our main conference room during business hours." Stephen's voice was measured, almost gentle. "Miss Carter has been allowing a contractor to bring his infant daughter to the workplace, and on multiple occasions she has engaged in behavior that raises serious questions about her judgment and emotional stability." One of the board members, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Morrison, leaned forward. "Elizabeth, is this accurate? Have you been nursing this man's child?" Elizabeth's voice was steady when she answered, "Yes." The room went silent. Stephen's expression flickered with something like triumph before settling back into concern. Patricia continued, "Can you explain why?" "I can." Elizabeth opened her own portfolio. "But first I'd like to address Mr. Carter's other concerns. He's suggested that my leadership has been compromised by personal trauma. Let's examine the evidence." She pulled up a slide on the monitor, replacing the security footage with a financial summary. "In the 2 years since my accident, Carter Shipping has seen 12% growth in revenue. We've expanded our fleet by 8 vessels. We've secured 2 major defense contracts worth a combined $47 million. Our safety record is the best in the industry, and our employee retention rate is 93%. She advanced to the next slide. These are not the metrics of a failing company or an incapacitated leader. Stephen cut in smoothly. No one is questioning your past performance, Elizabeth, but the board has a responsibility to consider your current state. The psychological evaluation I submitted clearly indicates that evaluation was prepared by a consultant who never examined me, using medical records you obtained illegally. Elizabeth's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Dr. Bennett's notes were accessed without her consent or mine, which makes this report not only medically unsound, but legally actionable. Stephen's jaw tightened. The board deserves to know about your condition. Then let me tell them myself. Elizabeth advanced to a new slide, this one showing an ultrasound image. The room went very still. 2 years ago, I was 7 months pregnant with my son. His name was Jonah. I lost him in the car accident that paralyzed me. What Stephen's report fails to mention is that my body never fully processed that loss. I've been experiencing galactorrhea, spontaneous lactation, as a result of elevated prolactin levels driven by unresolved trauma and nerve damage. Patricia's expression had shifted from skepticism to something closer to shock. You've been producing breast milk for 2 years? Yes, it's a documented medical condition. My endocrinologist has recommended medication to suppress it, which I've declined because... Elizabeth paused, and for the first time her composure wavered slightly, because it felt like letting go of the last physical connection I had to my son. Another board member, a man named Thomas Chen, spoke up. And the contractor's baby? Her name is Sophia. Her mother died 4 months ago from postpartum hemorrhage. Her father, Robert Williams, is a maintenance contractor I hired in August. He needed to bring his daughter to work because he couldn't afford childcare. Elizabeth looked directly at Thomas. When I heard Sophia crying one day, my body responded. The lactation reflex triggered. I made a choice in that moment to help a father who was struggling and a baby who was hungry. Was it unconventional? Yes. Was it a sign of mental instability? It was a human response to a human need. Stephen stood, his voice rising slightly. Elizabeth, you're describing a situation where you, as CEO, engaged in intimate physical contact with an employee's child without proper consent or oversight. That's not human compassion. That's a boundary violation that could expose this company to significant liability. Elizabeth turned to face him fully. You want to talk about liability, Stephen? Then let's discuss the real liability in this room. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Stephen's face went carefully blank. Elizabeth continued, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of 2 years of silence finally breaking. The car accident that killed my son and paralyzed me happened on Route 1 near Rockland. The police report states that I was driving, but that's not true. You were driving, Stephen. You'd had 2 bourbons at a client dinner. You were over the legal limit. You missed the curve. You rolled the car, and I took the blame. Patricia Morrison stood abruptly. Is this true? Stephen's face had gone white. Elizabeth, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 2 years. Elizabeth's hands were steady on her armrests. I told the police I was driving because I thought protecting you would protect this company. 3,000 employees, their families, their livelihoods. I thought if the truth came out that our CFO had killed the CEO's unborn child while driving drunk, the scandal would destroy everything we'd built. She looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. So I sacrificed my legs, my son, my reputation, and my right to grieve publicly. And Stephen has spent the last 2 years using that sacrifice as leverage to advance his own position. Thomas Chen's voice was sharp. "Stephen, do you deny this?" Stephen opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. Patricia turned to Elizabeth. "Do you have proof?" "The hospital records will show my blood alcohol level was 0. Stephen's medical file from that night will show his injuries were consistent with a driver's side impact, not passenger side. And if you subpoena the restaurant where we'd had dinner, their receipts will confirm he ordered 2 bourbons between 7 and 9 p.m. Elizabeth's voice didn't waver. "But more than that, you have 2 years of my performance as evidence. I've run this company through the worst trauma of my life. I've delivered results. I've protected jobs. I've built a future for Carter Shipping, even while the man who destroyed my past has been trying to take my place." The boardroom erupted into overlapping voices. Stephen was trying to speak, to explain, to salvage something from the wreckage of his ambitions, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Patricia Morrison banged her hand on the table. "We need to vote. But first, Stephen, you need to leave this room." Stephen's face twisted with something ugly. "You're going to believe her? She just admitted to lying to the police, to covering up a crime, to protecting this company at enormous personal cost." Patricia's voice was ice. "Get out, now!" Stephen gathered his portfolio with shaking hands and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that felt louder than a gunshot. Patricia turned to Elizabeth. "We need to discuss this privately. Can you give us the room?" Elizabeth nodded and wheeled toward the door. As she passed Robert in the hallway, she didn't look at him, but he saw the tremor in her hands. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. Robert walked the hallway with Sophia, bouncing her gently when she started to fuss, watching the door and trying not to think about what it would mean if Elizabeth lost. When the boardroom door finally opened, Patricia emerged first. She looked tired, older than she had an hour ago. She gestured to Robert. "Bring Elizabeth back in." Robert found Elizabeth in her office, sitting by the window with her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he entered, her face carefully blank. "They're ready." Elizabeth took a slow breath, then nodded. She wheeled past him without speaking, and Robert followed, still carrying Sophia, still feeling like a witness to something that would reshape everything that came after. The board was seated when they entered. Patricia stood. "We've taken a vote, 5-1 in favor of maintaining your position as CEO with 1 abstention." Her expression softened slightly. "Stephen Carter has been asked to resign, effective immediately. We're prepared to offer a severance package contingent on his signing a non-disclosure agreement regarding the circumstances of his departure." Elizabeth's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders dropped, and for just a moment she looked like someone who'd been holding her breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. "Thank you." "Oh, don't thank us yet. We're also recommending that you take a leave of absence. Not a forced one, but a voluntary one. 2 weeks, 3 if you need it. Use the time to get proper medical care for the galactorrhea, to speak with a therapist, to process what you've been through without the pressure of running this company." Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. "You've earned it, and we need you healthy for the long term." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I'll consider it." "Please do." Patricia glanced at Robert, then back to Elizabeth. "And, Miss Carter, for what it's worth, what you did for that baby, for her father, that wasn't a liability. That was leadership of a different kind. The kind that sees people, not just profit margins. We could use more of that around here." The meeting ended. Board members filed out, some stopping to shake Elizabeth's hand, others simply nodding in acknowledgement. Within minutes, the room was empty except for Robert, Elizabeth, and Sophia, who had fallen asleep against Robert's shoulder. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, staring at the empty chairs. "I thought I'd feel different." "Different how?" "Lighter, vindicated, something." She looked up at Robert. "I just feel tired." Robert moved to sit in the chair beside her, adjusting Sophia carefully. "You just fought the hardest battle of your life. Give yourself time to feel the win. Stephen's gone. The company's safe. I should be celebrating. Should is a useless word." Robert watched his daughter sleep, her small chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. "You did what you had to do. You told the truth. You survived. That's enough for today." Elizabeth reached out, almost hesitantly, and touched Sophia's hand. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around hers. "What happens now?" Elizabeth's voice was quiet. "Now you take that leave of absence. You talk to Dr. Bennett about the cabergoline. You let yourself heal." Robert met her eyes. "And when you're ready, you come back and keep building the future you fought so hard to protect." "Will you still be here?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with more than just employment logistics. "My contract ends in 2 weeks." "I could extend it." "You could." Robert shifted Sophia slightly. "Or I could finish the job I was hired for, and we could figure out what comes next from there." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll figure it out." They sat like that for a long time, the three of them in the empty boardroom, while outside the windows Baltimore Harbor went about its business, and the world kept turning, and somewhere on the 13th floor a mobile of wooden whales hung in silent witness to everything that had been lost and everything that might still be found.